Hi. By way of introduction to this particular video, for the 20 years that I have been pastor-teacher at GCA, and really for many years prior to that, I have adhered to what I refer to as a face value hermeneutic. In other words, in understanding the Bible, I start with what does the Bible actually say? And I take the words on the page at face value. I start with the assumption that these are the words God used because these are the words that best convey the meaning that he was conveying to us. In other words, the Bible says what it means and it means what it says. And I don't change that hermeneutic whether we're talking about soteriology, whether we're talking about overarching theology, or whether we're talking about eschatology. I take the Bible at face value. As a result of that, I adhere to what is known as premillennialism. All that means is that I don't think we're in the millennium described by John in Revelation 20. I don't think we're in that period of time yet. I am convinced that Christ comes back, just like Revelation 19 says, he comes back prior to the 1,000 years that John speaks of. So that's pre-millennial. I am also pre-tribulational, and all that means is I am convinced that Christ is coming back for his church before the 7 years of tribulation that are written about in Daniel and written about, well, Jesus talked about it in Matthew 24, and in the book of Revelation we read about it. It's a time of trouble such as never was or ever will be again, which Jeremiah specifically calls the time of Jacob's trouble. So the church, I am convinced, is caught away, is the Greek term, caught away by Jesus, so we meet the Lord in the air, and so will ever be with the Lord. Since that is happening before the tribulation, that is pre-tribulational. So I am premillennial and pre-tribulational. This video has to do with one of the arguments against that position, which is why I took a moment to kind of explain the position so that you can understand the argument against it and so that you can understand my reply to the argument against all of that. So that's what this video is about. If that's your cup of tea, stick around. If not, I'm sure there are videos of cats playing pianos somewhere that you'll find much more entertaining. Okay, roll the graphics. Here we go. So the argument goes like this. The Bible says that Jesus is coming back. In fact, the Bible refers to it as the second coming. But you pre-mill, pre-trib guys say that Jesus is coming for his church and then waiting 7 years and then coming in judgment and then setting up his throne. So you guys seem to say that there's a second coming and a third coming and a fourth coming. And so really, how many second comings are there? That's the argument. When you look at what the Bible actually says, it's pretty easy to dismantle that argument. But the only reason that I'm bringing it up in this video is because it's an argument that's awfully popular. I see it bandied about a lot on social media. And so if I make this video in response to that argument, then whenever it comes up again or anybody asks me about it, I can just send them the link to this video and I won't have to go through all this again. So let's start with this reality. There's only one place in the whole Bible where you see a phrase similar to second coming. The actual phrase second coming or second coming of Christ doesn't exist anywhere in the Bible. So at face value, we'd have to say that that is something that people say as reference to a certain event that they are expecting, but it's not truly a biblical phrase. The closest we come to it is in Hebrews 9:28, which says this: "So Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation, without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him." Now, for sake of clarity and by way of definition, when we differentiate between Christ's first and second coming, usually what we're doing is we're saying everything that had to do with Christ's original incarnation, his birth, his life and ministry here on planet Earth, his crucifixion, and even his ascension, all comprises what we would call the first coming of Christ. And then the second coming is when he returns eventually. Whatever that entails and whenever that happens, that's what we refer to as the second coming of Christ. With that in mind, and in order to respond to the charge, how many second comings are there? I think it's helpful to go back and look at the first coming of Christ collectively and see how many appearances of Christ really comprise what we refer to as the first coming of Christ. Because, after all, if the first coming of Christ includes several different appearances of Christ, then there's really no problem with saying that the second coming of Christ is going to include several different appearances of Christ. That just seems rational to me. So let's walk through this logically. Let's count the period from Christ's birth until his resurrection as one comprehensive whole. Immediately after his resurrection, he would not let Mary touch him, and he said, "I have not yet ascended to the Father." That's John 20:17. But soon after that, in a matter of days, he appeared in the midst of his disciples, and Jesus invited Thomas to touch him. You read about that in John 20:27. So then I think it's safe to assume that he had been to his Father, because he said to Mary, "Don't touch me, I haven't ascended to the Father." And then he said to Thomas, "Here, touch me." So what changed? Well, I think it's impossible not to conclude that he had been to the Father. In other words, he left the planet and then he returned. So how do we label that? What is that? Is that a second coming? No, we would say that's all part of his first coming. In other words, his first coming has multiple appearances, like the fact that later he appeared to his two disciples on the road to Emmaus. You read about that in Luke 24. And then later, he actually stood in their midst as they recounted that story. You read about that also in Luke 24, starting at verse 36, because the apostles were talking about the fact that Christ had appeared to Peter. And then the disciples from the Emmaus Road said that they had also seen him. Okay, well then that's a couple more appearances of Christ that take place over time, and we refer to those all collectively as his first coming. Then he appeared again to Peter and another 6 apostles by the Sea of Tiberias. You read about that in John 21, the first 14 verses. And then the book of Acts begins with the story of Jesus' ascension, where he's enveloped in clouds and taken off into the heavens. And an angel of the Lord appears to the apostles and says, "Ye men of Galilee, why are you looking up at the sky this way? Why are you gazing into the sky? This same Jesus is going to appear in like manner as you've seen him go." So that is a prophetic, angelic foretelling of the return of Christ at some future date. We would call that the second coming. But then, well after his ascension into heaven, Christ appeared to Saul of Tarsus, who was on his way to Damascus. You read about that in Acts 9, 1 through 8. In fact, Saul, we just know him as the Apostle Paul, made the argument for his own apostleship based on the fact that he had actually seen the Lord. And we read about multiple appearances of Christ. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now. But some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. That's 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8. Paul's last missionary journey happened around 67 AD, and best history and tradition tells us that he was then crucified by Nero. And so that is a good 30-plus years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Meanwhile, again, best history and church tradition, and the writing of the earliest of the church fathers, says that John was on the Isle of Patmos during the reign of Domitian. Well, we know when Domitian reigned, so that puts John on the Isle of Patmos sometime in the early 90s AD. And that's where he received the vision that we know as Revelation. And he tells us that Jesus appeared to him. He even describes what Jesus looked like. So there's another appearance of Jesus in the early 90s AD. That would be 60 years past the time of his death, burial, and resurrection. In other words, over the course of time, over the passing of time, there are several appearances of Christ. Some to particular and individual people, like Paul, like John. Even the people traveling with Paul, though they heard the sound, they didn't have the same experience of conversion that Paul had. Paul was made an apostle, and none of the rest of them were. So Jesus can and has appeared to particular people at particular times in order to accomplish particular redemptive things. That's all inarguable history. And he appeared over the course of minimally 90 years. From his birth until his appearance to John, he appeared many times over what is almost a century, and yet we refer to all of that as his first coming. That's the category that we place that all in. Now, none of that begins to address the Old Testament Christophanies, and it's not the purpose of this video to get into them. But the fact is, the Bible tells us that there were pre-incarnate appearances of Christ in the Old Testament. So through the course of human history, Christ has appeared and appeared. So not only is there a first coming, but there are pre-first coming appearances of Christ. Now, the whole point of all of this, the whole point of this video, is to say that when we contend that the Bible describes the return of Christ in several different appearances, in one we are gathered to meet the Lord in the air, and so will ever be with the Lord. Zechariah has him coming to the planet, and his feet touch the Mount of Olives, and the mount splits. So those sound to me, the details sound like two different appearances. He's coming back with the thousands of his saints. We read about that in Revelation 19 after the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then chapter 20 begins, chronologically, with the 1,000 years that we spoke of previously. Those are all individual and separate appearances. But that's fine. There is no contention, there is no difficulty with saying that the second appearance of Christ, the second coming of Christ, includes multiple different appearances, because that is exactly what the Bible actually describes. So, when somebody asks, how many second comings are there? I would answer, only one. But within the framework of that second coming, there are many different appearances. And not only is that not contradictory, it is exactly what the Bible says if you just read the Bible at face value. The first time Christ came, there were multiple appearances. He did it once. He can do it again. And that's the second coming.